With the celebration of Warner Brothers turning 100 this year, I figured we talk about a film that is one of their historical footnotes, House of Wax of 1953. Not to mention it's a nice round number because it's also 60 years old.
Yeah.
Or 70.
Gosh,
70.
we're
What?
all
I can't
getting
do
older.
math. Right. It's one of those. So we're going to celebrate one of the films of Warner Brother finance, but it's also the first full-color 3D film produced by American Studio.
Yeah, and it brought us Vincent Price as an evil guy.
Right. If you're doing a horror movie in the 50s, you don't have Vincent Price in it, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah. Shape up, people from the 50s.
Right. So we're going to talk about one of the classics from the 50s. Very pivotal point of horror movies. We'll get to it a little bit later. It's The House of Wax.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm one of your hosts, Kyle Goethe from GoatFilmReviews.com.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick from the St. Paul Filmcast. Thanks for watching. Thanks for finding us. And for our loyal fans, thank you for continuing to support the show. You can follow the show on Twitter and on Instagram. Yep, we do have a Patreon. Check that out for some great deals. And not only more content to review for our Patreon subscribers, as well as an opportunity to tell us what films to critique in the future. Both Kyle and I are members of the Minnesota Film Critics Alliance. Check out that webpage for critics' reviews as well as ours. And today we're talking about a classic horror movie from the 50s, House of Wax.
The brilliant and detailed sculptor Henry Girod supposedly died when his business partner burned down his wax museum with Girod inside. Sometime later, Henry is found alive, but injured and restoring his wax figures, though there's something unusual about his new figures. They all look strangely like people who have gone missing or recently died.
It's the first full-color 3D American film. It is the second 3D movie to be released by a major studio, Warner Brothers. I think there was a Paramount picture that came just a couple days before this one.
Yeah, it was the first black and white 3D film during this craze, of course.
Yeah. Funny historical thing is the director lost his left eye and could not see three-dimensional film. So he never got the gimmick of what. Yeah, André Dutoit lost his eye as a child, his left eye, so he can't see three-dimensional. Vincent Price credit, that's why the film was actually a success. His daughters claimed that maybe because he didn't know the technique that he wasn't going to over bombard us with 3D.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's that is the reason I think this is one of the best 3D presentations. I actually have the movie in 3D.
No kidding.
On Blu-ray 3D, the dead format. I still have my 3D version of it. I watched it this morning that way. And I think that we have 3D movies that tend to get overburdened, and I always look at you, Friday the 13th Part 3, where everything is being chucked at the screen. And I think 3D is one of those things where you just have to have subtle nuance with it. And of course, Price even said too, like that was the great irony of being in Hollywood, is that you would make a 3D movie and hire a man who doesn't see out of one eye,
I always credit like 3D film. It's kind of like having a crash cymbal as a drummer. You don't want to hit that crash cymbal every 30 seconds. You want to find the right time to use it.
Yeah.
And 3D film is like, you want to find the right time to really emphasize. There's a ping pong.
That's the best
paddle,
irony of the
not
movie.
the paddle, like a ping pong. Yeah.
Is because the most notable piece of 3D in the film is that ping pong scene, or paddleball thing.
Paddleball.
Which was not invented until the 1920s, so it's actually out of place here. But what's funny about it is that whole sequence is about a man using a gimmick to draw in the audience.
Yeah, trying to hit your popcorn.
The most notable piece of 3D, a gimmick used to draw an audience.
Yeah, it's really inserted in there. Very obvious.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's directed by André Dutoit. Some surprise appearances will be like Vincent Price. This is kind of broke out his career. He was doing not really supporting roles, but really wasn't a name until this movie.
Yeah, I think he had been in the second Invisible Man film.
Yeah.
Where he was playing, again, the Invisible Man, but he was more of a tragic hero in that, whereas this was kind of the springboard to his villainous roles.
Yes.
That we would later see him kind of taking on and evolving with other films throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s. The rest of his career, basically, he credited this film as being like, now I can play villains, and I do it well.
In the movie, there is, of course, an Igor to every bad guy, and it's played by Charles Buczynski, who would, a year after this, change his name to Charles Bronson. And I love Charles Bronson in this movie. Every time you see him, he's like, this thing right here, this right here.
Yeah.
He's just obviously flexing for every moment he can. The guillotine, this right
Yeah. I've seen this film a handful of times. This being the first time, for this review, I watched it for the first time in 3D, which I had not seen it in that version before. Maybe it took 3D for me to finally notice that was Charles Bronson, because I was flabbergasted. Like I saw his credit on the film, and then I was looking stuff up, and I was like, wait, he's in this movie, and I had to look and look and look to find him in the background.
Side note: there's a great Twilight episode with him, Charles Bronson, and Libis Montgomery. They're like the last two people on the Earth. Kind of check that out if you ever.
That would be Death Wish 6. He killed everyone else already.
That is kind of like right, yeah. But it's like how didn't know each other and. The greatest, one of the best Twilight episodes. You have the female protagonist or the lead, Phyllis Kirk, who was very reluctant but was under contract to do this. She didn't want to become the next Fay Wray. I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah,
but she kind of warmed up to the idea. She said she enjoyed being on set. It was kind of a lot of fun. She thought I think it was just going to be you stand in this place and just scream your head off or something.
Yeah, she didn't want to be like. Fay Wray, of course, being in the film that this was remaking, Mystery of the Wax Museum by Michael Curtiz.
Yeah,
it's obvious that you can make that comparison, but of course, like she probably assumed the King Kong of it all as well. Like I don't want to be the person shrugged through from environment to environment screaming, and she actually doesn't scream that often.
No, but there's
any time she does.
There's a weird scene of her at the end. And it's just from here up, but it almost looks like her clothes off, and it's like in 3D. It's like, that's kind of risque. I mean, that's kind of...
Yeah. Well, it's funny, because I guess she was wearing some sort of, like, flesh bodysuit
right.
that sequence, because, of course, they wanted to be as respectful as possible, and she kept saying, they kept telling her to lower and lower the bodysuit during close-ups, and she was like, I don't have a whole lot going on here, so sooner or later you're going to find out what it is.
Right.
It is funny that this movie got... so many banes of things that were cut or trimmed or production code. They had to change one character from being addicted to heroin instead of now he's an alcoholic in this version. And the funny thing is that this movie got hit by the production code more than the predecessor because there was no code when Mystery of the Wax Museum came out.
Mystery of the Wax Museum was pre-code.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny that the remake actually got hit with more stringent observations.
But it's still, I mean, there's a 3D, if you're wearing 3D, there's a shot of a girl flipping her skirt and showing her tushy.
Yes, there is.
Dead center. Like, yeah.
I love 3D sometimes. But yeah, even the Mystery of the Wax Museum, one of the first lines of dialogue from that film is the female protagonist coming in and going, hey, so-and-so, how's your sex life? And I was like, 1933. Like,
right. So, yeah, this brings out, villainous Vincent Price, who's very, I think he likes playing the villain because he's very salacious. He's always kind of the smooth kind of villain.
Yeah.
Because this is before he got attached to do Roger Corman films.
He's a beef jerky villain because he is always chewing on everything around him. He is just consuming everything. Like every line of dialogue drips with this kind of, like I'm villainous and I'm not even hiding it.
So, yeah, this is probably my third time seeing this. I've seen him, we have Svengoolie here in the United States. I've seen on Svengoolie. But his character is almost a mixture of like Phantom of the Opera meets Jack the Ripper meets Jekyll and Hyde. This duality of I'm a nice guy, but I'm a bad guy. Or, I'm creeping in windows. Or I'm infatuated with... So it's almost like a mixture of those three villains. But I do like the look of this. It's very chalky. I don't know if I could say that. It's like pastel-y kind of aesthetic to it. If he's watching stills like we were doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a very much like a... Yeah, chalky might be the right word. I just had recently watched the Hammer version of the Phantom of the Opera, which came out roughly at the same time and has the same... beautiful aesthetic to it. Like the movie is just gorgeously presented, and it feels kind of like that heyday of almost like a VistaVision Technicolor time period where just everything splashes with color. And that makes those more gruesome scenes work even better. I love the melting of the wax in the opening. It looks delicious and weird.
I know, it's almost like you want to sell these wax figures as real people, and then you just watch them melting, like, this is gross. I don't know about that are wax, but yeah.
Well, I'm still not sure if some of the like background wax figures were real people or not, because some of them looked so realistic that I'm still not sure if it was someone who was very good at holding their breath.
There was a danger filming this because the fire that catapulted Vincent Price, Henry Gerard's going catatonic, actually got out of control. They had to call the fire department.
Yeah, and apparently Detoth was still shooting when the firefighters entered the scene and started taking the fire out. Maybe not something you should do as a burgeoning filmmaker, but he did it. So. And
also, Vincent Price mentioned in his memoirs that he was banned eating in the lunch cafeteria with the makeup on at the Warner Brothers studio lot. So he had to eat lunch by himself with that makeup on. It's actually very good makeup. I'm really still surprised when he's like his real face and they cut to like she breaks the face and it's like the reveal. I'm sure that had to be a big surprise for those kids in the 50s. Like,
Well, and I watched The Mystery of the Wax Museum, the predecessor, yesterday, and I was just like thinking to myself during that whole like revealing scene, I was like, wow, this is really good for the 30s. This might be better than The House of Wax. And then I watched this one and I was like, oh no, this is really, really good as well. Like it's impressive to see a film that really like envelops and takes lots of things with it. It is funny that you mentioned that he was eating alone in the cafeteria, because I wonder if he had the same kind of thing in Dr. Phibes.
Oh yes, yes. I forgot about movie. God, he's got so much. We have to talk about.
We'll come back to that one.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Vincent Price. Then you have like Phyllis Kirk. I mentioned her, and then you have a lot of some other supporting roles of almost like these two guys, these two detective guys that I've seen you recognize before. But the sets are wonderful. I do like the crescendo where it goes, because you could tell this big vat. It's almost like they took that vat and put it in Batman.
Yeah, it's another thing that's just almost a complete take from that Curtiz film too, because I just every time when I watched that one I was like so shocked. I was like, that vat is huge, of course it's going to be the set piece. And then rewatching this, like, yeah, they had to take that because it's really, really good in both movies.
And so it has a lot of inspiration. I'm trying to mention, I'm doing the scenic route taking it. I'm sure Tim Burton loved this movie and tried to put the big vat going in the vat.
Oh yeah,
even though this one is pink, it's Pepto-Bismol.
Yeah,
it's liquid boiling Pepto-Bismol.
Well, we've all been there after a stomach ache. But you mentioned some of their performance. I was, again, like, not realizing Charles Bronson was in this film. I also was very shocked to discover Carolyn Jones playing the other female character in the film, the first victim that we see, because again, I when I watched this film last, I had not seen much of the Addams Family TV show, and so revisiting it, maybe it was the fact it was in color, I didn't connect that we were looking at Morticia.
Without the makeup, right?
Yeah.
She's already, you got to feel like, yeah, that's right. So you have, I love the gag of him, what would John Wilkes Booth say? Well, I don't think he would keep his mouth shut. It's very hard for actors to be quiet.
Yeah,
right? That's paraphrasing. So there's a little peppered in comedy. I think the horror element is there is shocking, but it's not overbearing. I think it's kind of a nice little template. But I think at the time you had to get kids and people in the studios for 3D, because television was a big hit. People were staying home watching television. You needed gimmicks to get people back in the theater. Here's 3D, which puts a little bit of shock value into it, but we have to obey the code. And I think they kicked out a heck of a movie. It still stands.
Oh yeah, I consistently I get a little bit of flack for this. I do think this film is one of those remakes that gets missed when we talk about remakes, because it has a different title, because it's just kind of its own separate thing. A lot of people don't know it's a remake, but it gets missed a lot in those conversations for some of the most impressive and thrilling remakes ever made. Maybe it's also because the film itself had another remake in 2005 that was schlocky and goofy and silly, and you only paid money to see Paris Hilton get impaled. And
and that was kind of trapped in its time and wanted to be. Okay, so up next, of course, is, well, we already kind of lead in our review of House of Wax. Okay, for multiple showings, it is an interesting footnote, and I think it should be recognized to watch, because it's, it's almost it's over close to 70 years old. I'm trying to do the math, but it's a historical footnote because everybody's tried to capture what that film has done. And I think it launched Vincent Price's career, even though he was kind of a recognized person, but this was make him be in other horror movies.
Yeah. And this was a few years before Hammer made it big with their first Frankenstein film in, I think, 57, and their first Dracula film in 58.
You can see
I think this right here is a big progenitor where if I told you this was a Hammer movie, you'd believe me. Like,
right, yeah.
You'd just be like, yeah, of course it is,
Yeah.
And I didn't want to hint at it too much, but I do think this is a superior film to the Curtiz 30s film. I think that film is fine. I think it's perfectly fine. But I think this one takes all of that grand guignol, graphic violence, the beauty in the blood, and really amplifies it, and I think streamlines the film. Even though it's 10 minutes longer than that film, actually feels it runs at a quicker pace.
For me, I love the flavor of when a horror movie tries to present things almost like a candy world when it's horrific underneath. And this is kind of it. Above the surface, Vincent Price's character is supposed to be charming, charismatic. He just works with the wax museums. He talks to them like there's people, and he's kind of charming. Then you see this devilish kind of a person. It's almost like, is it really him?
Yeah.
And you see the underbelly of what he could be, and that's why I think it's a little more like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. But everything about it looks like it's supposed to be presented like you're at a candy store. And it's kind of like treated like a museum almost. Yeah.
Yeah, this is one of those time periods that doesn't get talked about. The 50s to 60s hammerish time period. Right. You know, of course, not being one, but it is very much one. We don't talk about this being like one of those iconic levels because we, of course, have our 30s with like the Universal monsters. People talk about the 80s because it was the 80s. But I think outside of things like the 70s, 80s Italian kind of horror, this is one of my favorite forgotten time periods in horror. I could sit back and watch a Hammer or a Technicolor Dreamboat horror every single day for the rest of my life and be fine.
Yeah, well, the hook on the wagon of what your counterpoint is, because a lot of people, when they talk 50s horror movies, really want to only talk about the atomic horror movies, or the ones that are just, because the 50s was the start of marketing movies directly toward teenagers to get them, and that was the start of it. And this is not really marketed for teenagers. This is trying to get either kids, the whole family, to get there.
Yeah, that's true.
Even though it's a horror movie, they wanted to get everybody. They want to be able to catch a wide net. Where the giant spider, atomic spider, the blob, were for teenagers to go to the drive-in and half pay attention to the movie.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think we were 1 year away from getting Godzilla in, and then another year or two before it made its way stateside. So we were kind of reaching that time period of this being one of the last major horror releases before the bug thing happened, before the atomic age, before all that kind of stuff. But it's also maybe one of those things that if it hadn't been what it is, we might not have had the Hammer Renaissance that we had, just because it works so well.
Another thing I want to emphasize, this is kind of like another thing of Hollywood presenting a mirror to itself. We talked about other movies kind of like this, and it's almost like Hollywood telling, well, we idolize these certain objects, and we treat them almost like props, even though there might be real people, to the point that we're almost evil.
Yeah. It's the idea that we can possess a person and make them
mold them into something else.
Yeah, and make them into something they're not. I mean, there's some interesting ideas that I'm not 100% convinced were intended, but I think that as viewers we can glean after several decades and think, wow, like this was one of those films that was about something even when it didn't need to be. You know,
it's almost unconsciously, but it's almost in the movie organically. They're talking about this. Kind of like maybe this is what we should reflect on what we do in Hollywood. We kind of treat people the same way as Harry Gerard treats people in the Wax Museum.
Yeah, we view them as possessions, and we don't like when they fight back.
And especially when an accountant torches your bill, your own accountant gets mad at you, right?
Yeah. It's a confusing thing because I think a lot of people have tended to place the film House of Wax under the idea of the wax figures come to life. And I think part of that comes from the idea of wax work in 1988 and films like that where it was about the wax figures coming to life. People thought that would be this movie in hindsight. You know, at the time, of course, it is what it is. But I think the legacy of the film is kind of muddled. If you haven't seen it, you don't really know what it's going to be about when you watch it.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize this is another one of Warner Brothers taking a big risk, putting a lot of emphasis and a lot of money to a big payoff, hoping it will work.
Yeah,
and putting 3D out there, full color, which was very risky at the time, an investment that actually paid off. I mean, this is kind of like them almost doing The Jazz Singer all over again.
Yeah, we're recording this as CinemaCon is going on. And I remember that I was just listening to this great bit of dialogue from David Zaslav, who's in charge of Warner Brothers now. And he said he had told his two people in charge of the filmmaking process, think of movies like Casablanca. Think of the movies that are classics and make the films that you will be remembered for. Make the films that will be your legacy. And I think if House of Wax 1953 is anything to say, there was a good legacy back then.
Yeah. Overall, I think film technique-wise, it's very basic. There's a lot of simply just set that on the mount and get your shot, but you're working fast. I think they filmed this 28 days earlier ahead of schedule.
Yeah, not only that, but it actually came in 50% under budget, which is, I'm not even sure how you even do that, because Detoth said he was given $1.25 million to make the film, which is quite a bit for that time period.
No kidding.
And he came in at $616,000 after 4 weeks. Again, I'm not sure how you do that. But obviously, if you base it on a film that you already have, you have a little bit of blueprint. That film itself is based on a 3-act play. So you have these things you can go back to. And that's probably why the camera doesn't move, is it is based on a film that's based on a play. So you have a lot of big talk moments.
It's more dialogue heavy than I think people want to remember or retain. There's a lot of stunts. I mean, it's very obviously the stunt people, when the guy for the Vincent Price type guy. Don't look at my face.
Yeah, exactly.
But I would say to move fast, they did well with the dialogue writing, keep the pace going. But it's not extravagant, very fancy camera work because you're working fast, and I think it still pays off.
Yeah. I find it interesting that this film is marketed in a very unique way. I had to do some research to make sure that the story was correct, but it sounds like Bela Lugosi is one of the reasons why this film was a success, because he was part of the marketing, even though he wasn't in the film.
Okay.
He was invited to the premiere, and they knew that he needed money because he was struggling at the time financially with his addiction. And so he was invited to the premiere. He showed up in his Dracula cape with a leash, and what was under the leash was a person in a gorilla suit, kind of playing off the Bela Lugosi meets a gorilla film that had come out recently. So it's one of those things that has nothing to do with the film, but it made kind of this splash of marketing right during the film's premiere.
Yeah.
And created something really weird out of it.
Yeah, so you have to credit him enhancing people to talk about it.
Yeah. I wonder how many people saw the film and said, where's the gorilla and where's Dracula?
Right, yeah. I expected. And also, you get your 3D glasses. Did you get your 3D glasses?
Oh yeah. Not on me, but I was. I've got one of those dying 3D Blu-ray players where it's like you can buy films for like $4 now for 3D because no one has this device, and I'm just going to keep mine alive as long as I can.
I would like to borrow that. Okay, what do you think? Keep the conversation going in the comments down below.
Yeah, let us know what your favorite House of Wax film is. There's 3 of them. You can pick, or maybe your favorite wax-related film. Maybe you're a fan of Waxworks 1 or 2 or Terror at the Wax Museum from the 70s. Let us know what wax horror film is your favorite.
Forgot how many there are.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and they keep coming. Yeah. They do. Thank you guys for joining us so very much. Make sure to follow those links like Nick described. They're all down in the description. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find all my film reviews over at goatfilmreviews.com.
You can find my show, The St. Paul Filmcast, anywhere you find podcasts.
All right. Wax positions.